Right. Hello, this is Layla Benitez James for Telltale Poetry, and I'm sitting down with poet and professional troublemaker Nico Amador. His writing has been featured or is forthcoming in a number of journals and anthologies, including Bettering American Poetry, Volume 3, Poetry Unbound, Hank, Poem a Day, Arc Poetry Magazine, Poet Lore, The Cortland Review, Bedfellows, and elsewhere. His chapbook Flower Wars was selected as the winner of the Ansel Dua Poetry Prize and was published by Newfound Press in 2017. He's a grant recipient of the Vermont Arts Council, an alumni of the Lambda Literary Foundation's Writers Retreat, and an MFA candidate at Bennington College. He also works with People's Hub, an online platform for popular education, cultural organizing, and training for social change. Nico, thank you so much for chatting with me today.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
So I've been really interested in thinking about overlapping identities and recently heard a really brilliant talk about a new book coming out called A Black Gaze by Tina Kant. And her bio, she says that she is a Black feminist theorist of visual culture and contemporary art. And they chatted a little bit about how important it was for her of naming where she was coming from in that way. And so when I first heard your work and heard you read your work at the Unamuno Poetry Festival, I was struck not only by your poems, which are amazing, but by the way you really foregrounded your creative work by talking about your social justice work. And I found that really admirable and impressive. And personally, as a poet, who I feel like those two things are more separate than they should be in my own practice a lot of times. So I've read a couple of your thoughts about this already. And so I wondered if we could start by just hearing you elaborate a little bit about how reading and writing poetry keeps you creative and allows you to deal with the pressures and demands of social justice work. And if you could share more about how these passions either balance each other or feed into each other.
Yeah, I mean, thank you for the question. And I feel like we could spend the whole interview exploring just that. I just feel like there's so many ways I could come at that because it has just been so, the overlap between those two have been so central to my experience of both, you know. Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, one thing that I want to share about it is that when I became politicized as a young person, a lot of that was reading, especially women of color, queer people of color writing. And so there's something, you know, just about literature and poetry and writing that really supported my growth and my consciousness as a young person. And I think at the time, you know, what that did for me was it gave me a kind of language that allowed me to understand myself. You know, it allowed me to kind of put my experience as a queer person and a trans person and someone who's mixed race into context of a larger, you know, a larger movement for justice, a political identity that connected me to other people. So that, you know, that was just really important to kind of where I landed in terms of the work that I was doing. I think over time, you know, where that started to feel limiting was, I think I built a sense of my own identity around this kind of language of struggle and oppression and movement work. And that's still very kind of close to my heart, close to how I think about the world. But there was just a moment in time where, you know, maybe going into my early 30s where I'd been organizing for, you know, at that point, at least 10 or 12 years, where I just felt tired, you know, I just felt like I couldn't access the same things that had given me drive previously, you know, just kind of riding on anger was not enough for me anymore. I felt like there was, just a sense of exhaustion around that. And maybe just a sense that there were parts of life that I was kind of missing out on in some ways. because I had devoted so much of my energy to working on grassroots campaigns and learning how to be an organizer, learning how to be a trainer and a mentor to others. And I just needed something else that could sustain me in that work. And I think what I discovered is adopting an identity as an artist just gave me a different way in, or a different way of moving in that work that just felt a little more freeing. You know, like I think I got to know myself as a person kind of outside of the idea of struggle, and really got to ask deeper questions about who I was, about sort of like what drives me, what gives me a sense of joy in the world. And I think by engaging in that, I felt like I could kind of come back into organizing from a sense of curiosity and a sense of like, I'm really engaged in a question. You know, I'm choosing to do something that I'm really interested in, and the things that I'm not sort of interested in or curious about right now, I'm just not going to do, you know. And so I think it was a kind of shift of like, I'm no longer doing things out of a sense of obligation or a sense of like, I have to, but just a sense of like, here's where my energy's at right now. And I think that's, you know, I think that's one of the things that writing poetry teaches you is like, you're only going to be successful by following your curiosity, or, you know, whatever is kind of moving you at the moment. And so I think there's something about being in that, the practice of that craft that just helped me bring that attitude back to my organizing work. And I think too, you know, I think there's, you know, there's just so much pressure that activists feel. You know, it's like, as a poet, I can't ever sit down and say, you know, today I'm going to write the poem that's going to, you know, win me the Pulitzer Prize. Like we can't work under those conditions. Like we can't create, and if that's the kind of pressure we're putting down, you know, we're sitting down with. But I think activists do that all the time, right? Like I think we come at our workday, we come at the campaign that we're working on with a sense of like, if I can't solve climate change, what am I doing? You know, if I can't figure out how to like close a prison today, then I failed. And I think that can become a you know, just a very taxing, you know, very difficult condition to work under. And so I think, you know, it was helpful just to kind of, again, like have that shift where I'm like, you know, all I can do today is be present with the thing in front of me and with the people that I'm talking to today, and you know, employ all the tools, all the strategy, all the learnings that I have available, and that's all I can do, you know, is sit down with that and see where it leads me. I can't ask myself to solve the biggest problems. You know, it's just, I have to be in the experiment of it.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Also, I've never really thought about stakes in that way. Like I've talked a lot to people about like, oh, what are the stakes in your poems, and then like the stakes of activist work. But putting in that light, it makes a lot of sense why like coming to the page would be refreshing. And just that, I mean, not, you would almost get like, I guess they call it burnout, but like instead of getting writer's block, you have like an activist kind of block where it's like, yeah, it's hard when you can't, you know, fix a problem immediately because they're really, really big problems. And so I wanted to know too, like, does it go both ways? So you like kind of got into poetry as a respite from, you know, wanting to go back to activism a bit more refreshed. And so does it work both ways for you getting more involved with things when you can't write, or what do you do when you feel like you can't write? Or do you have that problem at all? Are you one of those magical people that sit?
Oh no, I definitely do. I do. And, you know, I mean, you were saying, just like the practice of social justice work and writing sometimes feel really separate in your own experience, and they do in mine too. I mean, I think there's a compatibility to them in some ways, and they also can feel in competition with each other in terms of my actual time and having to make decisions about, where am I going to put my energy? If I have a limited amount of creativity to like use in a day, am I going to put that towards a political project, or am I going to put that towards my own writing? And I do feel that split or that tension. So I think I've just come to like be okay with like a sense of like different seasons around it, and the feeling that like it's okay for me to choose to work on a book at times, and I'm going to give a lot of energy and time to that, and then that will shift, and I will feel called to put more of that energy into a campaign that I'm working on, or a training that I'm building, or whatever it is. But yeah, I mean, I do think it goes the other way. I think, mainly in terms of perspective, like I think being part of a political project or a collective of people who are working towards ambitious goals around social change does keep the writing in perspective in a way that's helpful. I feel like if the work that I'm doing outside of writing means that like one less person is deported, or one less person is in prison, or I helped a young trans organizer kind of find their confidence, or their their sense of leadership and purpose, like that's probably more meaningful than any poem I'm ever going to write. And so that has been helpful actually, to just be able to then come to the page and like this is something I feel moved to do. It helps me. I like the practice of it, and I don't need to feel anxiety about where it leads me. There's certainly a piece of me that like wants to be successful at it, and wants to feel some recognition, but it's helpful to just remember that like that doesn't, my life's purpose does not have to revolve around that. And probably at the end of the day, if I'm remembered for other things and not my writing, like that's okay. Like that's also been a success. Yeah.
And then, so would you have any, not that you have to have it all figured out right at the second, would you have like more practical tips for poets who are maybe either working outside of the more like normative mainstream poetics, or who are looking for tips on how to kind of balance that, being socially engaged, or maybe even for people who don't think those things can be mixed? I know I've heard as well, like, some people who are more socially engaged want to also talk about their work at a craft level and not always talk about the ideas. And sometimes that gets lost a bit, but I don't know if you have, or maybe for things that you tell to people who you're working with who also want to explore poetry.
Yeah. I mean, I think part of it is like knowing what your goal is, right? And I think the mainstream literary world is always going to be kind of pointing towards like a notion of success being winning awards, selling a certain number of books, getting published by certain publishers, getting the kind of fancy residencies, and those are all nice things to have. And I, like I said, there's a part of me that like wants some of that for myself. So I don't, I don't like reject it fully, but I think it is helpful to just kind of like not let that define your purpose in the work and why you're doing it. Like I know an organizer, Osley Hawkins, who's also a poet and just like self-published their second book of poetry. And, has sold more books just by like self-publishing and like being super engaged in the communities that they work with. And people like, have really like loved and embraced their writing. And it's been a way to like, I think for them to kind of show a different side of themselves to the people that they're organizing with. And I just really, like those are just helpful reminders to kind of see someone just being like, I don't need to go through these other channels, like lots of people will read these books and be moved by them, and it will mean something to the people that come into contact with them. And so I think it's just important to remember that there are different, different ways of being in the work and different ways of sharing it that are still really impactful, and I think that can still feed you as a poet. I think the other thing, to speak more to my own experience of it, is I think it's just trusting that like my pathway is just going to look different than it's looked for people who went like straight from undergrad into an MFA and who are maybe more on an academic track. I think I've still had a lot of touches with the mainstream literary world, but I think it's, maybe that's just been spread out over a longer period of time and kind of based on when I had space for it, when I had need for it, where it's like maybe I hit a moment in my writing where I just felt like I needed more instruction, or I needed more resource. So then like, applying for workshops in those moments. And I'm doing an MFA now, and I'll graduate the same year that I turn 40. So it's like, it's been a long and stretched out journey, but it's like, I feel like I'm really able to make good use of the program now, because it's like, I went into it kind of knowing what I wanted to get out of it and what questions I was asking. And it's felt like a really generative time for me. So I think it's just kind of like, being okay with making your own path and having that not mirror what other people are doing. And I also think that just being more focused on building relationships than on kind of chasing publications, or like I really don't do that many submissions or applications to things, partly because I just don't feel like I have a lot of time for it. And it's not always the best for my time, but I have spent, I've spent time like just getting to know people who I like as writers, or attending workshops where I can like build relationships with people that have been really helpful and supportive contacts over the years. And so I think that's also just like a different way of being, is like, prioritizing the relationship over the accolade, I guess, or the publication. And I feel like there's a lot of invitations that have come out of that, just because like, I know people and they're thinking about me, and I think in some ways too, people have been generous towards me because they know I'm not doing the same thing as everyone else. And so I feel like sometimes like people have reached out because they know, like they have an opportunity to highlight something that I'm doing that they know isn't going to be highlighted through an institution.
Yeah, I was gonna, maybe I'll just skip to that. I was gonna ask you a bit about your submission philosophy. I mean, a lot of people, it's kind of just like they either don't have one, or, but is there any sense of your social justice work in that submission policy? Like, are you more gearing towards places that are reflecting more diverse work, or is it more that people are reaching out to you, and that's kind of, I guess that would feed into each other. Your work would kind of be a self-selecting process. Then people are already know that they're interested in what you're doing, and then they're reaching out to you to see if you have anything to submit.
Yeah, I think it's more that second thing. And, and I think I've been paying attention to conversations in the literary world about about power, about access, about, you know, kind of who's in charge and making decisions. And so I think more and more I'm attuning myself to the publications that really seem to care about representation, that are that have more editors of color and queer and trans editors like on the masthead and that kind of thing. But yeah, like I said, I mean, I think it's probably annoying for some people to hear this, but most publications I've gotten, it's because the work was solicited. And I don't think that that's because I'm a really fantastic poet who's, you know, really sought after.
I'll say I think it's probably a little bit of that.
Thank you. I mean, I feel like I work hard at the craft, and I try to be thoughtful about, like, you know, when is something really like ready to go out in the world. And so I, you know, in my own process, try to really think about quality and think about what standard something has to be at before I want to publish it. But in terms of the actual process, I do think it's been nice just to, like I said, I think be more focused on like who I'm in conversation with, you know, who have I met, whose writing I really appreciate, and you know, because of that, like I'm gonna put myself in more spaces with those writers, whether it's like taking a workshop with them, or, you know, just like making time to sit with people at conferences and you know, letting people know that I read their work and that I appreciated it. And so I do think it's a little indirect, but I think that really does come out of my social justice practice, because I think, you know, for community organizers, it's like, you know, that like relationship is your main form of influence and of resource and power, right? Like, you know, yeah. a lot of organizing is about like being in relationship with people in a way that is like mutually beneficial and has some integrity in terms of like, here's the way we want to move forward together. Here is where we're meeting in terms of like shared interest and goals. And so I do think that translates somehow into like how I'm moving in the literary world, which is like, you know, I'm there to find my people. I'm there to like be interested in what other people are doing when it speaks to something that I'm also interested in doing. And so it's not about like networking in the with that question of like, how do I get ahead, or how do I like you know, kind of work my way into particular opportunities. I think it's really just about like, I want to gravitate towards the people that I think are have something to teach me, and you know, have, I think, a shared interest in terms of how we're thinking about our work.
Yeah, and you talked to in an interview about your advisor Jennifer Chang. And how, that I don't know if she was introducing you in the class context, or if you guys were just talking about, you mentioned decolonial poetics and craft, and I was wondering if you talk a little bit more about how you work on the page, and if that influences like the forms or like the languages, working in you know, both Spanish and English. And I was revisiting Flower Wars for the Sealy Challenge this month, and I was trying to think about the poems in relation to like a decolonial poetics, and so I was noticing more poems in couplets or torsets, and like you open with a prose poem, but I was really struck by, there's one poem, the principal state of the erotic is confusion, that has like those super short lines, and like one line is just wait, and then there are other lines that are just one word, and it's really broken. So it's like, it's really, you know, like form and content are really working together, but to destabilize, like not to, you know, bring some cohesive I don't know, kind of like form together. But then there were also a couple poems that were like 13 lines or 16 lines. And so it was almost like they were kind of like sonnet shaped without, conforming to that at all. So how, like when you're, composing poems and like getting it to that stage, are you thinking about how to shake things up formally a lot?
I mean, I think with Flower Wars, to be honest, I was really teaching myself to write in those poems.
Yeah.
A lot of those, I mean, I think the oldest poem in that book I wrote for maybe like the first or second creative writing class I took at the Community College of Philadelphia when I was like just like really starting to get into poetry more seriously. So I think there's a lot in there that's instinct, it was like
Right.
trying things out, feeling what different forms feel like on the page and what they do. So I can't say there was like at that stage, like a really developed philosophy around what I was doing, but I think in hindsight, or I think as I've continued to develop in my practice as a writer, I think I can look back and kind of understand like, here's, I think what instincts or what questions were kind of governing the shape that those poems took. And I've been really moved by some of the, more recent conversations and contact that I've had with, like I took a workshop with Young Mi Kim a few years ago, and she talked a lot about this idea of composition by field versus like a more conventional approach to form, and kind of allowing a political process to shape what was on the page and what shape that it took, particularly around this idea of like, kind of like what's acknowledged or what goes unacknowledged, like what's allowed to be included or represented on the page, and what takes the form of silence. And so I think in a lot of my work there's a kind of play between like what am I going to tell you and what am I going to withhold, or what's the thing that I feel like I know how to speak to or represent, and what are the things that I'm still kind of like struggling to articulate in some way. And I think I think in Flower Wars, a lot of that, a lot of those poems are being shaped out of a sense of like, there is a experience that I'm having, particularly around my identity as a trans person and as someone who's mixed race, that I can get at in these poems, but I don't know how to represent fully. And so there's also a lot of kind of unsaid things that sit around the poems. And I think that definitely shows up in the shape of them.
And then for something, I guess like Mexicans Lost in Mexico is more recent. But I love that the collaboration with making it into a video poem with Edith Reinheimer. But I was thinking specifically about, like you say, the days slide by uncapitalized, like thinking about the differences. And even just a play like that, somebody unfamiliar with Spanish might not fully get it. But I like the idea of putting more of those moments in, and like, that too, like destabilizes, the kind of like English only audience that a lot of, poetry written in English might have. And I feel like that's happening possibly more and more. Maybe I'm just noticing it more.
Yeah. I think I think that idea of translation, I think it also really shows up in my poems, of like, I'm sort of aware of like the ways that I'm like in and out of different cultural contexts, and trying to like represent like one to another, or even aware that like I can feel differently, or like feel my experience differently, like when I'm sort of working in one code and then having to switch to another. And so I think that, like the uncapitalized of like, here's my reality in one place. And then I'm kind of immersed in a different identity or a different cultural context, and that really like changes like my sense of shape in the world. So I think, yeah, I think that really plays into the poems. And yeah, and I think I work a lot by collage too, maybe for that reason. That there's like a lot of, even the poems that maybe take a more coherent or more or formal shape, I feel like are often still like me kind of like taking different pieces of things and trying to put them together and make sense of them.
Yeah, I love that idea of collage. And then to wrap things up, I always love to ask who people are reading, and who are possibly some of your readers or poets you really like to read who maybe don't even get mentioned enough, or who are you reading just now?
Yeah, I left my stack of books at my desk. Yes. I hold them up to the screen, but a couple books I wanted to mention. One that I don't know that I've ever come across another person who's read it. It's a novel called Ways of Dying by a South African writer, Zakes Mda, MDA. Is his last name. And it's this really beautiful book about a character who is kind of living unstably and sort of on the margins of society, but has assigned himself the role of like a professional mourner. And so he like kind of goes around to these different funerals in Cape Town and like grieves for the person who has passed. And there's a lot of social context within that book that's important, but it's one that I read years ago, and it's like I think I've like kept it out on my nightstand recently with the idea that I'll go back and read it again, because I think we're just in a time of like such deep grief, and I think there's something really beautiful about how that book speaks to like the kind of like imagination that could be possible within a context where there's a lot of violence and a lot of loss. So that book I really want to advocate for more people reading. And some other ones that I was thinking about, the writer Pat Califia, I really love all of his books. And he's someone that I think as someone that was writing about like trans experience and gender, like many years ago, like starting in the 90s, maybe I think has gone underappreciated for like for his particular body of work. And I've gone back to some of his essays recently, and I feel like they really stand the test of time. There's still things that feel really important and timely in terms of how he's thinking and talking about gender and politics and public sex. I think a lot of his writing about like sexual taboos and things like that are really important. So definitely Pat Califia. And then I think one of the books that has really been a big influence recently is the Lou Sullivan Diaries. Lou Sullivan was an early trans activist who from a very young age like identified as someone who was a gay man, and really like thought of himself as a gay man, but like could not really find an example in the world of someone who was like identified as a trans man and also identifying as gay. And so I think just getting to read his journals and his exploration and how he came to formulate his identity is just like incredibly moving to me. And then all the activism that he did to promote community and access for trans men during the 80s and 90s were, just like really important. And I think I could draw like some direct lines between the work that Lou Sullivan did and some of the things I benefited from in my time. So.
That's great. Yeah, I haven't read any of those, and now I want to read all of them.
Yeah, yeah. Okay.
But Nico, thank you so much. I am really looking forward to reading those, and I'm looking forward to reading what you put out next as well.
Yeah, thank you. Hopefully there's a lot more coming soon.
Oh, good. Yeah. It's